I'm really here just to add a little more detail about what it is the French American Foundation has done to address some of the problems and issues that Jim so aptly laid out for us. And I guess, as you mentioned, Charlie, I was a correspondent with Time in 2009 in Paris when I was asked by the FAF to help them organize these two conferences that were supposed to deal with these very issues that we're talking about. That is, how do you improve the journalistic treatment of this vast and often so horribly misrepresented issue of immigration? The idea was really very simple. It was to give journalists working on different aspects of this topic in different corners of the world a chance to kind of compare notes, to discuss their common problems, to get some kind of feedback from one another, create a network where they can kind of broaden their perspective about how to cover it. And as soon as we started putting together the list of participants, started to contact people, we looked at who had written great stories for various publications, what kind of, and we had stories from Ireland, about the massive influx of Eastern Europeans to Ireland, which completely transformed that country. We had stories clearly about France in the wake of the 2005 riots in the banlieues. We had obviously many of the issues that we've talked about here in the American context. And there's been a lot of great journalism written about it, but I think we found that we quickly realized there was a massive need for just the kind of thing we were planning, because these people that we were contacting, these reporters, all felt like they were kind of knitting away on one corner of a particularly large carpet, if you will, that they didn't know the whole aspect of or the whole extent of. So we ended up, I think we had 80 or 90 people that came to Paris in 2009, and then a similarly sized group to Miami the following year. Obviously both venues that we thought rightly would offer them a chance to look directly at some of the issues of immigration and integration that were very much political issues in those cities at the time. So we organized these conferences as a series of in-depth seminars with participants from both sides of the Atlantic talking about their approach to all kinds of issues. We had one panel discussing the practicalities of getting these stories into print or onto the screen. We had Jim Bitterman from CNN chaired that panel with Nina Bernstein from the Times, and I think a guy from the Irish Times was talking about this Irish problem. So we talked obviously about, we couldn't do much, but we had a few leaders there, a few media leaders to talk about budgeting issues and try to get more budget to talk about getting more resources committed to the issue of journalism, of immigration journalism, which remains a big problem, as Jim mentioned. We had other panels about how journalists could avail themselves of the many advocacy groups for journalism, both on the right and the left, which have great information and are a resource, but how do you use them while you maintain your independence? How do you create a balanced story by using this? It's a big problem. Much more so, it's more of an issue here in the States, where there are many of these organizations that have very much an agenda to put forward. In Europe, the whole structure around that kind of NGO is a lot less developed. I think we wouldn't have much of a problem, but certainly something we had to talk about. And then, we talked about particularly how immigration stories get framed and how they become cliches, and how the particular way a story has developed in a country becomes almost the formula by which every story has to be written. You're either for or against immigration in America. All the nuances of the story frequently fall away as if there's an issue like this one, where immigration is front and center before the House and before the Senate. That's one thing, but of course immigration is happening all the time. There's a massive range of stories to be done about it, and those are the stories that don't get done if you're only seeing immigration through the lens of whatever it is that's been kind of made an issue of. So we also talked and agreed, I think, that the vital part of solving some of these problems is to try to, number one, pull the very vibrant ethnic media scene into the discussion more than it is now. I mean, there's plenty of papers. We heard about Univision. There's many other newspapers and media outlets, particularly again here in the States as opposed to Europe, that need to be more central to the debate. And more importantly, perhaps, is the idea of getting the the newsrooms of America's mainstream press and of France's mainstream press and Europe's to better reflect the diversity of the societies around it. So both in Paris and in Miami, we also organized a series of what we called reporting opportunities, which were, the idea was to give participants a chance to get out and kind of see real situations relating to immigration. We had in Paris, for instance, one that went out and saw to the banlieues, to the areas outside of Paris, to talk to the banlieue vloggers, which is a group of mostly young, mostly North African origin French people who had come together in the wake of the 2005 riots in Paris to try to create a different perspective on that whole phenomenon than that of the central, Parisian representatives who came out there and frequently got stoned, because there was a lot of exclusion, part of what made that whole riot scene there in 2005 so painful and so difficult was that they felt that these people felt excluded from society, and the press itself in France was almost an example of the kind of exclusion they were fighting against. So, and then in Paris, or in Miami, for instance, we also went out, for instance, to Homestead, Florida, which is just outside of Miami, and talked to Mexican immigrants that were picking tomatoes there for unbelievably low wages, virtually no, and who were most of them not documented, and were extremely frightened at that point because this was right when the first Arizona law that's since been largely rolled back came out, that was really going to make it impossible for them to stay in the country. So, what did the participants of all these things learn? I mean, these conferences learn. I really can only encapsulate it a bit, but clearly we see, like I said, that there's this. They tend to be framed, these stories. You've got stories where immigrants are a threat to jobs, to wages, to the national cohesion, to the economic well-being of a country. You've got obviously stories where they're victims of global poverty, of inequality, of systematic discrimination. And sometimes we see them, as stories are cast with them as heroes, because they do bring, as Jim pointed out so aptly at the end of his speech, they bring economic and cultural vitality to their destinations. The difference is how these things all get played in Europe and in the US. It's interesting that in France and the Netherlands particularly, this whole idea of the immigrant as a threat has actually been a rallying point for some very significant political parties. We've got the Front National in France, we've got Wilders' party in the Netherlands. That doesn't quite happen, as we said. I mean, it doesn't really work for the Republican Party to get it cannot gain a majority by being anti-immigrant, as at least some of them recognize. It does justify them spending $30 billion on enhanced border security, but you can't really build a party around it. So that's an important difference. And also, I think we saw that in Europe, the religious aspect of immigration is a much greater issue than it is here, because the bulk of immigration stems from countries of Muslim origin, and that is an issue for people. That's something that the National Front people and others can kind of exploit in a way that seems to threaten the national fabric of France. And it's important to point out, unlike the United States, that Europe are now immigrant countries, but they're not historically immigrant countries. The idea, the reason France exists is because the people that lived in France decided that was going to be France. I mean, very simplified, obviously. But that's a very different equation than what we've got here. And then, just lastly, I just mentioned that because of this, we tend, as we see this week, to talk about this issue in terms of people coming over the border. And I think in Europe, particularly in the wake of the rise in 2005, the various problems in the Netherlands particularly, people see it more as a question of integration, because there's this idea of their state doesn't really include people that don't come from France or the Netherlands, who didn't originally. They have to do a lot of work to figure out how to make that work. So those are just, a few of the many things that we've explored in these conferences. And I can tell you that having listened to the passionate exchanges at both these conferences and talked to a lot of the participants afterwards, that I really do think that our efforts generated a lot of good stories, a lot of networking, a lot of richer cultural, contextual understanding of these issues across the whole gamut of immigration. And as Charlie mentioned, the foundation has now taken the next step and moved to actually providing funding for outstanding story ideas about immigration. I was honored to be part of the jury on some of this. We we had 160 applicants for the awards we gave this year. I don't know if you saw, and you should look if you can, if you get a chance to look at your papers that were provided to you. There's a list of the 10 winners. Interesting, I don't know, one of them is going to do a story about Ecuador's open door policy. He knew he was doing that before we even knew that it was going to be something relevant. I guess the thing in reading all of those, reading those applications for this thing, it was actually, because we hear so much of the demise of journalism, it really was extremely hard to see how many great ideas, how many unexplored stories are out there, how many hungry, smart young journalists are out there that would like to do this work. And it's a shame, well, it's great that we were able to provide the opportunity for the 10 that could, but we could have given scores more of these. So I think that it's important that we consider the idea, maybe if possible, expanding this program and getting these vital issues of immigration out there with the greater depth that they deserve.